Welcome to Module 2. In this lecture, we're going to focus on goals and social media strategy. We'll look at what it really means to be strategic when planning social media and digital communication, and how goals, strategy, objectives, key performance indicators or KPIs, tactics, and channels all work together. We'll also briefly discuss where AI fits into this whole process. This week, our focus is on the role that goals play in creating an effective social media strategy. We'll distinguish between communication and business goals. We'll also discuss SMART objectives and KPIs and look at situation analysis, tactics, channel selection, and campaign planning. By the end, I want you to understand not only the different parts of a strategy, but how those parts all work together. So, why exactly do we need a strategy? Social media is big, it's time consuming, and it can certainly be distracting. There are multiple platforms, audiences, content formats, trends, and conversations competing for our attention. Without a strategy, it's easy, very, very easy, to spend a lot of time creating content without knowing whether that content is actually helping the organization. A strategy gives us focus and helps ensure that what we're doing supports a larger purpose. As social media practitioners, we also have to remember that management teams are concerned with organizational outcomes. They're thinking about sales, revenue, cost, and results. They're also the ones making decisions about budgets and resources. So, part of our job is being able to explain the value of social media in terms that matter to organizations. That value may be revenue, but it could also include leads, web traffic, customer service, reputation, cost savings, and valuable audience insights. Now, in this class, we'll be looking at metrics, but metrics need context. In the past, metrics such as likes, followers, views, and reach were sometimes dismissed as superficial or vanity metrics. But I want us to think about this a little differently. These metrics aren't necessarily meaningless. Their value depends on the goal. If your goal is awareness, reach may be a very useful KPI. If your goal is engagement, engagement rate may matter more. And if your goal is sales, then conversions or revenue would be much more important. So when you think about metrics, I want you to remember that metrics need context. All right, let's try to understand goals a little bit more. Goals are your desired ends. In other words, they tell us what we're trying to accomplish. Before we start selecting platforms, creating posts, and deciding on tactics, we need some understanding of where we're trying to go. That's why I emphasize that you cannot have a strategy unless you have goals. Your goals provide direction and gives you something against which you can ultimately measure your success. Now, let's distinguish among three terms that are sometimes used interchangeably. A goal describes the broad outcome you want to achieve. Your strategy is the overarching approach or roadmap you'll use to get there. An objective breaks that broad goal down into something more specific and measurable. These three concepts should work together, and everything else, from your audience to your tactics should support the overall purpose of the campaign. We also need to distinguish between communication goals and business goals. Communication goals typically focus on changes in knowledge, attitudes, or actions. For example, you may want to create awareness, inform an audience, persuade them, remind them, or encourage some type of action. On the other hand, business goals focus on higher order organizational outcomes such as sales, revenue, attendance, market share, website traffic, leads, or customer acquisition. Your communication goals should ultimately help support the organization's larger business goals. And when we move from a broad goal to something more measurable, SMART gives us the useful framework that we need. Your goals or objectives should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time based. If I simply say that I want to increase engagement, that doesn't tell me enough. How much do I want to increase it by? Among whom or what platform, and by when? Adding these elements make it possible for us to determine later whether we actually succeeded. Here are a few examples. Notice that each statement identifies a specific outcome, a target audience, an amount of change, and a deadline. For example, rather than simply saying we want to increase engagement, we might say that we want to increase Instagram engagement among women ages 18 to 25 by 25% by the end of the fourth quarter of 2026. As you develop your own goals, I want you to be able to identify the SMART components within the statements. Before we finalize our strategy and objectives, we need to understand the situation. One tool we can use is a SWOT analysis. SWOT looks at our internal strengths and weaknesses and our external opportunities and threats. This is important because strategy shouldn't be created in a vacuum. We need research. We need to understand what's happening within the organization, what's happening in the external environment, and where we may have opportunities or challenges. So, how do these pieces come together in a campaign? We might begin with a problem statement and an overall goal. We then identify our target audience and conduct a situation analysis. From there, we can develop SMART objectives, create a work plan, establish a timeline and budget, and eventually develop an editorial plan and a social media calendar. Each of these pieces contributes to the larger strategic plan. Now, I want to make an important clarification here. Strategic planning isn't always perfectly linear. You don't necessarily begin with a SMART objective and then follow the exact same sequence every time. Sometimes you begin with a broad goal, which helps shape your strategy, and the strategy then guides you towards measurable objectives. Research may also change your decisions. You may learn something about your audience that changes your platform or your tactics. So there isn't one perfect order. What matters is clarity, alignment, research, and having a reason behind every decision you make. Let's explore key performance indicators or KPIs. Once we've established our goals and objectives, we need to determine how we're going to measure them. That's where KPIs or key performance indicators come in. A KPI is a quantifiable measure of performance for a specific objective. Depending on the goal, your KPI might be reach, impressions, comments, shares, saves, engagement rate, click through rate, conversion rate, website traffic, or revenue. Again, the KPI needs to match what you're trying to accomplish. This is why we don't simply select metrics because they're available in our analytics dashboard. We match the KPI to the goal. If the goal is awareness, we may examine reach or impressions. For engagement, we may look at engagement rate, comments, shares, or saves. For traffic, we might examine link clicks or website sessions. If we're focused on customer care, response time and resolution rate may be more meaningful. Start with the goal and then determine what you need to measure. Let's use this hypothetical company, Theosity, to help you see the difference. Suppose the business goal is to increase sales by 10% among women ages 25 to 45 within the next 6 months. In that case, sales or revenue would be an important KPI. A supporting communication goal might be to increase Instagram engagement among the same audience by 20% by the fourth quarter. For that goal, engagement rate would be the KPI. Notice that these goals are different, but the communication goal can help support the larger business goal. And once you know the goal and how we're going to measure success, we can start thinking about tactics. The goal tells us what we want to achieve. The KPI tells us how we'll measure success. The tactics are the specific things we're actually going to do. Depending on the goal, tactics could include creator partnerships, contests, challenges, user generated content campaigns, social advertising, shoppable content, promotional codes, or community engagement. The tactic should always have a reason for being there. Of course, in this era, we also need to acknowledge the role of artificial intelligence. Like I mentioned last week, AI can support many parts of the strategic process. It can help with audience insights, social listening, trend identification, content ideation, not creation, performance analysis, reporting, and optimization. But AI doesn't determine the organization's purpose. Humans still need to establish the goals, develop strategy, understand context, protect the brand voice, exercise their judgment, and consider ethical implications. So think of AI as a tool that can support strategy, not a replacement for it. Another important strategic decision is selecting the right channel. We shouldn't choose a platform simply because it's popular or because everyone seems to be talking about it. Ask where your audience is active, what you're trying to accomplish, how people use the platform, what type of content works there, what resources your organization has, and whether you can measure the desired outcome. The best platform is the one that makes sense for your particular strategy. Let's pause for a moment and use Instagram and TikTok as an example. Instagram gives brands access to reels, stories, carousels, photos, creator partnerships, shopping, and other forms of visual storytelling. TikTok is particularly strong in short form video, entertainment, discovery, creator culture, social search, and commerce. So, which one should you choose? There isn't one correct answer. It depends on your audience, your goals, the type of content you can create, and your resources. You might even determine that both make sense, but that doesn't mean you should use them in exactly the same way. As you begin developing a social media strategy, these are the questions I want you to keep asking yourself. What are your goals? Who is your target audience? Where is that audience active? What type of content do they want? Which platforms support your goals? What resources do you have? Which KPIs will tell you whether you've succeeded? And now we can add another question. How can AI support the strategy without determining it? If you can answer these questions clearly, you're much closer to having a genuinely strategic plan. The bottom line is successful social media requires a strategic plan. Goals give us direction. Strategy gives us an overarching approach. Objectives make our progress measurable. KPIs help us evaluate success. Tactics, channels, and messages put the strategy into action. And measurement allows us to determine what worked and what may need to be changed. Research keeps all of these pieces aligned. The tools may change, but remember, the need for strategy does not. Catch you on the next one.